Hello, I'm Tammy Rose, and welcome to Concord Days. We engage by divine grace to behave ourselves soberly and chastely, in heart, speech, and action, in charity and peace towards all men, earnestly desiring a nearer conformity to that rule of our blessed Savior. All things whatsoever ye would that ye men should do to you, ye even so to them. That's a quote from the Reverend William Emerson, who was the minister of First Parish between 1765 and 1776. He was Ralph Waldo Emerson's grandfather. Now let me hand this off to my co-host, Richard Smith. Hey, Richard.
Hi, Tammy. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you. I'm very excited about today's program. We have two eminent Concord historians with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce Victor Curran and Jim Sherbloom. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Good. It's nice to see both of you. Thank you for joining us today. So this is going to be a little bit of a wide-ranging conversation, but we're definitely going to get a little bit into the history of First Parish in Concord and among other things, social activism. So Victor, you of course are associated with First Parish, correct?
Yes, I've been a member for about 25 years, and it's really thanks to First Parish that I became interested in the transcendental. There was a minister there some years ago, Reverend Jenny Rankin, who was also a scholar of the Transcendentalists, and it was through programs that she originated that I really started to develop that interest.
But First Parish didn't always have such a love affair with the Transcendentalists, did it?
No, it didn't.
So maybe talk a little bit about
nor they with it.
What's the difference between First Parish in 1845 and First Parish in 2021 in terms of transcendentalism?
Well, of course, in 1845, that was still Barzillai Frost was the minister there, and he was the one who Waldo Emerson said he'd rather look out the window at the snow falling than listen to Barzillai Frost preach. Frost was also the one who resigned as a curator of the Concord Lyceum when the abolitionist Wendell Phillips came to speak. And he was the one who told Henry Thoreau that he couldn't ring the bell to announce Emerson's anti-slavery speech in 1844, though Henry did not take no for an answer.
Right. Well, wasn't Frost the one that Emerson described it as corpse cold Unitarianism, somewhere along those lines?
Yes.
So
Isn't it, Jim?
Yes, that's part of his Divinity School address.
Why is Unitarianism not corpse cold anymore as compared to the way it was in the mid-19th century?
So when the Transcendentalists were active, they were a radical extreme, and they were seen as a logical extension of Unitarian thought, but not the mainstream Unitarian thought. Over time, Unitarianism moved much more transcendentalist. So now if you queried most of the things that that Emerson talked about for a typical member of First Parish today, they would say, oh yeah, that's Unitarian Universalism. Whereas in 1845, they would say, no, that's that German idealism that it really hasn't taken here in America.
Now, didn't some Unitarians at the time consider themselves Christians, even though they didn't necessarily, some of them, believe in the divinity of Christ?
Yes, Unitarianism is a Protestant denomination that it only split away from the Christians more because the Trinitarians weren't willing to accept anyone as Christian who didn't follow the Nicene Creed, and the Unitarians don't follow the Nicene Creed. So that's when the Trinitarian Congregationalists moved across the Millbrook in Concord to the other side and set up a church. We kept cordial relations, but they increasingly didn't view the people who were still at First Parish as being Christian anymore. because of the Nicene Creed.
And were the Unitarians, I mean, today when we think of the UU Church, I think we instantly think of social activism. Certainly a lot of UU churches are very involved in the BLM movement and LGBTQ movement and things like that. They weren't necessarily social justice warriors in the mid-19th century, were they?
I think it's, again, if you look at a typical UU today, they may be more or less involved in social justice. If you look back to the founding of First Parish, there's always been an active core there, whether it was the Women's Parish Association, which was among the group that first came up with the Female Anti-Slavery Society, or even all the way back to the founding minister, Peter Buckley, who went out of his way to make sure that people were financially solvent, to the extent that his kids bemoaned the fact that he had a bigger fortune when he immigrated from England than he had at his death some many years later, because he had helped endow so many former indentured servants and local kids with what the farms they needed in order to be independent.
Wow, I didn't realize that. Victor, can you sort of give us a little bit more of a grounding of who Peter Buckley was and the founding of First Parish and the founding of Concord as well? Just because you teach the Concord tour guide course.
And give it to us in like 3 sentences. No.
Concord was the first inland English settlement in Massachusetts. English settlers had been in Massachusetts since 1620. All the early settlements were along the coast because they were very dependent on the mother country. In 1635 was when they established the settlement at what was then called Muscataquid, and the English changed the name to Concord. The initial leader of that expedition had been Simon Willard, who was a fur trader and former army officer who knew the land because he traded with the native people of Muscataquid for beaver skins. But the general court didn't really see him as having the kind of gravitas to be the leader of a new town. And so they paired him up with Peter Buckley, who was a Puritan minister just lately arrived from England. Willard was about 30, Buckley was about 50. He had the maturity, but he had another, as Jim mentioned, another important qualification to be the leader of a town, which is that when he got out of England, he brought a lot of money with him.
Of course. Even then, money made the world go round, right? I mean, that's why they were in the New World anyway.
Right, and that's an important piece of Concord's history, that in order to grind their grains, and they needed a tannery and they needed a mill, and to make the mill work, they needed a mill dam holding back the brook so they get the water pressure. So all of that was funded by Buckley's fortune, as well as the money to build the first church up on the ridge above where the church is now. So you needed, it was a very hierarchical society. You needed a few wealthy individuals who were able to create the public goods for the community.
And how many families were in the first settlement here in 1635?
It was about 12 families, about 100 people.
Okay. And so I think that we tend to think of the Puritan world as being really centered around the church in so many ways. Was it that way in Concord as well? Absolutely.
The First Parish was the only church in Concord for almost 200 years. There was not another church in Concord until 1826. And so the church and the town were inextricably linked. The minister's salary was paid by taxes. And it really was until the 1850s that the governance of the First Parish became entirely disentangled from the government of the town.
One of my favorite
that was later than most of Massachusetts.
Right. One of my favorite
stories was really late.
Right. One of my favorite stories relates to Peter Buckley's son, Edward Buckley, who became the minister at First Parish after Peter died. And he had been homeschooled. He hadn't had the great education his father had. And now the next generation was going off to Harvard and be trained, so that the local lawyer in town and the local doctor in town both had gotten used to at Harvard to a very high scholarly level of lectures from the pulpit, and Edward wasn't providing that. So they both, in writing, mentioned that they thought they needed a new minister bringing in, and they actually brought one in, Joseph Estabrook, to give them Harvard-style lectures. But they both were sued by the minister in court for saying negative things about his preaching in writing.
And I guess people don't realize that there was a really close connection between Harvard College and the Unitarian faith. Well, congregational, but then the Unitarian faith, correct?
Yeah, so the term Unitarian didn't really gain wide currency in the 1920s, but that line of thinking had been developing for a while. But yeah, both the First Parish and Harvard University, both founded in 1636, and they have been closely associated for all that time.
Yeah, and didn't Harvard actually have to relocate to Concord very briefly?
Well, not so briefly. It was for almost a year. It was for the 1775-76 academic year, because once the American colonies went to war against England, George Washington came to Cambridge, and he took over the Harvard campus and turned it into an army training camp. And so William Emerson, who was the minister at First Parish and also a Harvard grad, said to the president of Harvard, "Why don't you bring all your students and faculty out here to Concord? We'll have classes out here while the campus is being used as an army training camp." So for that year, it was easier to do it. The student body was only about 150 students. But they were in Harvard for that year. Of course, a member of that senior class that spent the senior year in Concord was Ezra Ripley, who would later become the minister of First Parish.
And our longest serving minister.
Right, 62 years, right? He was the minister?
63.
63, right. So we've talked about Reverend William Emerson. His son, William Emerson, became a minister. Then William Emerson's son, Ralph Waldo Emerson, became a minister as well. Of course, then Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote Nature. It was published in 1836 and kind of became the de facto leader of the Transcendentalists. I'm sorry?
It's important, Rich, to remember that the Emersons, that line of the Emersons is all descended from Peter Buckley.
Right.
So Concord keeps weaving this family back through it over the centuries.
And so Waldo took that lineage very seriously, which is why I think he ended up in Concord as opposed to Plymouth, where his second wife would have preferred to have lived, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So right there, I've always considered Emerson to be like the not so missing link between Unitarianism and Transcendentalism, since he was a Unitarian minister. And then, of course, he more or less became involved in the anti-slavery movement. So he kind of took his role seriously as an ex-minister and being involved in social justice, didn't he? Yes. I mean, eventually.
And the Transcendentalist movement in Massachusetts really got started at a Harvard function where they were staying for one of the Harvard reunions. The whole group of young ministers, Unitarian ministers, who got together at the Willard Hotel and decided to have a conversation about these new ideas out of the English movement in poetry and the German ideal thought. And it really was built around Emerson, his personal charisma, and Henry Hedge, who was the most brilliant German scholar and had studied for 5 years in Germany with the German idealists, to the point that they called it Hedge's Club for the first year or so. So that it really grows out of Unitarianism, the young radical Unitarian ministers.
Yeah,
Well,
and Richard had just casually mentioned that Emerson was an ex-minister by the time that Transcendentalism really got going. Does anybody want to talk about how Emerson actually broke from his faith and quit the ministry?
Jim, you talk about?
Sure. So he was failed at other things, and so went to become a minister in his family's tradition. And he was fine as minister, and because he came from such a wonderful line, got appointed to one of the best paying jobs in Boston for a Unitarian minister. But then his wife, after a very short marriage, died, and he was in deep grief. And his congregation wasn't particularly supportive of that. And then he was struggling with these theological issues around offering communion, because now that they were no longer Trinitarian Christians, it wasn't clear that the communion service they inherited made sense at all. So he went to his governing board and he said, "I'm happy to continue to serve you, but I will not do this communion." And they said, "The minister has to offer the communion. It's the tradition." So he said, "Okay, I'm going to just cash in my chips." He resigned from the church, cashed his chips, and went traveling Europe to go visit with all of these people he had been reading avidly that he had never had a chance to see. And surprisingly, since he's a very young man at this point, they actually almost all agreed to see him. And he has lifelong friendships with people like Wordsworth and Carlyle that date to that time when he is going on a grieving trip to try and get over the death of his wife.
And I know that some of the men we've been talking about, like Hedge, and certainly people like Theodore Parker, James Freeman Clark, all of these ministers, they were all pretty obsessed with the Germanic thinking from the period. Maybe for those people that are watching that don't know, if you can briefly explain the deal with the Germanic thinking that became known as Transcendentalism here in America.
Mm.
From my perspective, it's really what we mostly look back at on as Immanuel Kant's basically taking the new translations that were coming into Germany of the Bhagavad Gita and some of the ancient Asian texts and trying to make sense of them with Western philosophy. And it's this notion that that there's multiple levels in which one can experience reality, and that the highest level of reality, that which is we now call transcendental, is the same reality everybody else is sharing, but they're not noticing it, that it's being open to the universe in a unique and splendid way. And it was that so impressed these young Unitarian ministers. They're going, "Oh, if I have a choice of living life in black and white or in color, I'll take color."
Which is why Emerson was so impressed with the snowstorm and not Barzillai frost.
Right, exactly. He wouldn't describe Barzillai Frost as living in black and white.
So let's get into a little bit of First Parish and social justice and equal fighting for equal rights for various groups. What sort of involvement is the church involved in today? I know that there's a BLM sign in the front of the church. So Victor or either one of you would want to talk a little bit about the social involvement that the church has these days?
Well, there is a staff position that is social action director, and it's Jim. Do you want to add to that?
The Social Action Council, for the 35 years I've been a member at First Parish, is probably the biggest organization within the church. So
Wow.
Oftentimes up to half of the membership will be actively involved over the course of the year with some of the social action projects.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And I've definitely attended several services during COVID, and there are announcements and there are all these, extracurricular activities saying, here's an opportunity to participate. Here's a workshop. Here's, a way that you can make a difference.
Right. So I'm deeply religious and hence became a Unitarian minister myself. But my wife has never been particularly interested in these things, but she is as active in the congregation as I am because of the social action aspect. That's what brings her into the community and acting as a community, trying to transform the world. What the Transcendentalists would have called the self-culture, that you work on yourself, but only through your means of connecting with the rest of the world. It's not a narcissistic self-culture. It's a self-culture to help you be a better instrument for transforming the world to where you'd like to be.
I think
Go ahead, Victor.
one of the things that I think about sometimes in the context of a church, and you see this in the history of First Parish, think about Peter Bulkley being a philanthropist in the community and helping out the less fortunate people in the community. This idea of a congregation not just being a place where you go and pray on Sunday, but as a community of people who help one another, is, that's kind of baked into the Puritan worldview. The Transcendentalists actually place more emphasis on the self than on the community, but a parish, a congregation is both things. I think a lot of the time we get in trouble because we sort of think of religion as being loyal to a set of ideas, and that your loyalty to that set of ideas might actually turn you against other people who don't share those ideas. But another very important strain, in not just in First Parish, but in religious communities everywhere, is that being part of a religious community is loyalty to a group of people, not just to a set of ideas.
Well, and also recognizing these people as humans and figuring out how to apply the idea, for example, freedom and equality and social justice, to apply it to everybody within your immediate community, but also to work for it on a larger scale. I'm thinking of like the abolitionists, the reform, the people in the reform movement, but in First Parish today, I feel like that's the piece that they're really hanging on to, and really enhancing their community and making the community wider by using their power, their influence to make a difference in the world. And Jim, you had actually recently given a lecture, if you want to talk about that, about the history of Concord in terms of Native Americans and the African Americans that really don't get recognized as much, out in the world or even in the history of Concord.
So we have a virtue now, thanks largely to Amazon and modern technology, that no historian before us has had. So over the last 400 years, there's been 7 or 8 histories, some of them broad and encompassed, some of them quite narrow, written about Concord, Massachusetts. And most of the writers, most of them had access to Lemuel Sherrick's first 19th century history of Concord, but most of them didn't read each other. And each one of them is written from a particular cultural context. So you now go back and look at it and you go, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of things they didn't tell us that we now know to be true. And there's a whole bunch of things they told us that we now know are not true.
Right.
So
Right.
the idea that the settlers came here and bought 6 square miles from the indigenous people is inherently untrue. It's not possible to have been true. The indigenous people had no concept of property ownership beyond the clan or tribe. They had no concept of writing or reading or signing documents. They were willing to try and make peace with these colonists. But you look at the historical records and they paid money, Buckley and Willard, to the colonial legislature to buy the right to go and inherit the indigenous village. And that's the other piece that we only now is documenting in the last 5 years, is almost all of the early Mass Bay towns are on the sites of indigenous villages that had been wiped out from the pandemics that had occurring waves of pandemics. So Plymouth and Salem and Boston, but Concord too. It had been the most western village of the Massachusetts tribe was here on this side of the Musketaquid. And it appears that the most eastern village of the Nipmuc tribe was on the other side of the Musketaquid. So when we celebrate Tehatuan or Squaw Sachem, they are living on the Nipmunk side of the Musketequid over on Neshotic Hill, but it was the Massachusetts side of it that had recently been wiped out in the 82-83 pandemic coming into this Musketequid area that would now open fields that were vacant and available for the colonists to come and settle. Mm. There's not anything inherently wrong with that story, but it's a very different story than the way we've told it.
No, it's not quite the genteel, everybody's happy founding.
Thanksgiving, yeah.
And Simon Willard's one of my favorite characters. He came with a fortune, the younger son of a Puritan landowner in Kent. And as Victor pointed out, was trained in the military. So they immediately snapped him up and made him a senior military officer. And when they were going to put this outpost out in the indigenous territory, the furthest into the indigenous wilderness in 1635, they were delighted to have an army officer be part of the process. And Willard made this great relationship with the indigenous people. He actually learned Algonquin so that he could trade with the Nipmunks and became a very close ally and friend with Tehadawon. But in the end, his fortune that he passes on to his children is mostly property that was transferred to him from the indigenous people when they couldn't pay their bills for all of the Western goods that he kept bringing them. And when they set up Concord as a village underneath the Esker Ridge, in between that and the brook that became the Millbrook, he decided he didn't want to live with the other founding families, but he went and lived over in Neshotic Hill at the foothills of Neshotic, so he'd be closer with the indigenous people, because that was his closer friendship, his tie.
And what happened, I don't know if they ever really talk about it. So after Concord is founded, what happened to the peoples that were already living here? Did they vacate the area? Did they stay close by?
So the people who on the side that was initially conquered had vacated already, so they were open fields. The people on the other side of the Musketequid River, gradually, they made peace with the colonists. They actually, that first winter, that they were critical of the survival of the colonists because they had to come show them how to live in this particular environment. But over time, as they became more and more impoverished, they kept selling off pieces of their land that they had been set aside for them, mostly to Willard, but to other entrepreneurial white people. And eventually Willard and they converted to Christianity. That John Eliot came out here at Willard's request and held prayer meetings for them. And Tehadawon decided that his clan was going to survive. They needed to convert to Christianity. So they converted to Christianity. And then Eliot and Willard goes to the state legislature and say, these are Christian people. We need to set aside a reservation for them that they can live on in perpetuity for all time. And they set aside the Neshoba Reservation over by Nagog Pond, what is now on the Lincoln-Acton line. Yep. And that was given to them in return for them agreeing to sell all the rest of their property to the colonists, again, mostly Willard. And they were there for a generation. But then when King Phillips War happened in 1675, basically there were too many Nipmunks that were living further west that had sided with King Philip in the battles, so the people were freaked out. And then after one of the Concord families had two brothers killed while they were haying in their field and bringing in the hay, not far from Neshoba, the state legislature issued a warrant for their arrest of any indigenous people they could find. And Captain Mosley comes out here with a group that's not going to be paid cash unless they can find indigenous people to round up, because they're going to only be paid out of the proceeds of selling them into slavery. And there's a famous Concord First Parish meeting house meeting where the ministers are present, and this is Edward Buckley and Joseph Estabrook, where they argue over whether or not they have an obligation to these people they've known their whole lives to protect them. And it's down to 58 indigenous people, and they are locked in the bond of the local lawyer, John Hoare, who argues eloquently that these are human beings and they need to be protected against this militia, and he loses the argument. They vote in the town meeting to have them arrested, to issue the warrant that came from the State House, and they get collected there and taken off to Deer Island and about half of them end up dying on Deer Island, and the other half get sold into Caribbean slavery. Now, there's still indigenous people around, including one of Tahatnon's son-in-laws and one of his daughters, because they signed later land deeds selling other property off to the colonists. So we know that they didn't all go away and that they've always been here, but over 90% of them were gradually destroyed in those first 2 generations.
Wow. So Victor, these are the kind of stories that as historians in Concord, we're starting to talk about more and more, aren't we? We're not just talking about the dead white guys anymore. we're really trying to involve lots of other people.
It's good that research is being done about these stories, because these stories haven't been told. We rely on the work of archaeologists like Shirley Blanca to tell us about the life of the native people before the English came. People have been living here for 12,000 years. And we know what we know about their lives from studying the tools that they made and used. The Concord Museum has a terrific collection of those tools. And a couple of years ago, the Concord Museum created a new exhibit about the people of Mescataquid, which I was really happy to see, because the old exhibit of stone tools, they were in glass cases like fossils.
Right.
And they looked like relics of an extinct civilization. And the story that they want to tell is, this isn't an extinct civilization. The Nipmuc and Wampanoag people are still very much here, and this is their history. And that's the, and Nipmuc and Wampanoag consultants collaborated in the design of that exhibit, and I think they did a nice job with it.
And we're also starting to talk more about the Black presence in Concord. We're starting to talk more about women's history of Concord. So I feel like it's only been the last 10 to 15 years that we're starting to get more of a well-rounded picture about what Concord was, other than April 19th, 1775. And the Transcendentalists.
Yeah. And also, so in the middle of Monument Square, there's a plaque, sort of a plaque like on a stand, and it's about Jethro's tree. And I think it was put up in the 1930s, and it was like, here is where, the plot of land that is now Concord was sold, from the Indians, from, like, using all the old language, using all that old history. And Jim, I know that you're actively involved in trying to make either like a visual narrative or something that's sort of a little bit more permanent, at least inside of First Parish. I've heard that you want to create some kind of display, or that you're interested in maybe trying to commission a painting or something. Can you talk about?
We're just talking about how to lift up the history appropriately. I can tell you the history, that the myth, how that myth was created about Jethro's tree. So in 1689, the new king decides he needs to rein in these colonies in the New World, who've gotten way too independent during this whole period of the Puritans fighting, Puritan Parliament fighting the king. So he agrees with Parliament that they're going to send a counselor to Boston, who seems the most rebellious of the colonies, and change their laws. And so the first thing he does when he arrives, he says, you were under an old charter. We're going to revoke that charter. So anything that property you got as a result of that charter, now you're going to have to repurchase from the crown. And so immediately all of the colonists started scrambling, going, wait a minute, how do we not have to go through this process? So the people in Concord, who had gotten several land grants under the old charter, basically got together the oldest indigenous people they could find and had them all swear out testimony that they were there as young people when, under this tree, they signed a treaty that sold the property from the indigenous people. So this wasn't granted from the king, this was purchased from the indigenous people. And you go, wait a minute, we know they didn't have a concept of selling property. We know they didn't speak English. We know they didn't sign documents, but nevertheless, it's in the record. And then the record, it goes so far as to say, why do we not have that document anymore? And they go, oh, it must have gotten lost sometime over the years. Yeah. Nobody thought it was that important.
But let's put up a plaque to make sure to tell the story this way.
Problem, we have in past centuries, when historians didn't have access to primary sources, they just made up primary sources. This is a problem with Shattuck too. People treat Shattuck as a primary source, but Shattuck is writing about April 19th, 1775, 60 years after the fact.
Right.
And he's not a primary source for a lot of these things. But there's an interesting point about how the English and how the indigenous people saw that transaction, because of course people, as I say, thousands of years, and a lot of people think that until the English came, indigenous people had a kind of Stone Age civilization, and that nothing changed until the English came, which isn't true.
Right.
They were spear hunters at first, starting around 1600 years ago. They began hunting with bow and arrow. This is something they undoubtedly learned through their network of trade with other North American tribes.
Right.
Around 1,000 years ago, they began to practice agriculture. Again, probably learned through trade with other North American tribes. So when the English showed up and they had metal tools, as far as the Musqueam people were concerned, these were just another tribe with cool stuff. And, and of course, as Jim pointed out, the indigenous population of Concord had been reduced from about 1,000 to about 100 people by 1635. So in their view, there was room enough for everybody. These new people show up, they've got cool stuff. We're all going to live here and be one big happy family. And of course, the English, for whom private ownership of property was the most important social principle, their idea was, we're going to give you this cool stuff and we're going to live here and you're not, which is what ended up happening.
And I feel like it's really been within the last 15 to 20 years that this is the understanding that we're starting to have. I remember in '99 when I moved to Concord, everybody loved Shattuck. Shattuck was the book. Oh, you have to read Shattuck. And now it's like one of the last things I would recommend to people if they want to really get a good understanding of the history of Concord. And Jim, you're working on a new history of Concord, aren't you?
Yes, and it's going to take me a couple of years, but I've started going back to all the old sources, including the new understandings we have about African descendants and indigenous people, and rewriting now basically a biography of Concord over the last 400 years.
And any idea when that's going to see the light of day so we can look forward to it?
Probably about another 18 months. I've finished the first two of the 10 chapters, so it's still got a ways to go.
Congratulations. That's great.
Perfect. So,
yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. We could probably go on for another 3 hours about this stuff. But Victor, before we go, is there anything you'd like to talk about or you'd like to plug that's going on in your world in terms of teaching history or anything like that before we go?
Well, we've just, as you know, graduated a new crop of students from the Concord Guide course, which I teach every winter, and that is necessary to receive a license from the town of Concord. I think it's for about 100 years ago, the town of Concord decided that you need to have a to be a tour guide. I will be in the fall teaching again the Concord's Historic Women course. Was a course that I just introduced last fall, and that's been a lot of fun to put that together. And we're getting into the busy season for tours, and so I'm excited. You know, we're going to be able to get more people outdoors. The pandemic seems to be giving us a little bit more breathing room, so looking forward to it.
Yes, the town of Concord is open for tours. We should tell everybody. So,
Yes.
so come to Concord and get a tour.
Yes, Absolutely. And we try to keep information current. We have a Facebook group called Transcendentalist 2021, which I'm sure is actually going to go on beyond 2021, to talk about latest news of Concord and the oldest news of Concord, all sorts of Concord history, and especially the history of Indigenous people and African-American people. We're very excited to feature all of this history that hasn't really been told.
So Jim and Victor, thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you that have been tuning in, thank you for watching again this week. And this has been another episode of Concord Days.